An eviction tsunami is coming in LA City. Is that what the numbers are showing us? Kenneth Mejia, the LA City Controller, has just released the eviction notice data for LA City, and there are 50,000 eviction notices that have gone out. In this guide for renters and landlords, we're going to properly frame the data. We know that people are either going to willfully or out of ignorance misuse and abuse this data. This does not mean 50,000 families are going to be kicked out of their units in LA City. We're going to cover exactly what the data means, and stick around to the end because we're going to show you that it actually undercounts some evictions. Hey there, Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates. We have been helping landlords and tenants understand their rights before things go wrong. And remember, we can't give tax or legal advice, but for the most honest and up-to-date real estate advice, subscribe to this channel. Let's take a look at the LA City eviction notice data put together by Kenneth Mejia, who is the LA City Controller. This is a handy way to visualize the number of eviction notices that have gone out. And these red zones, these are hotspots where there's concentrations. This is for LA City specifically, and this data is compiled because anytime a landlord gives a notice to terminate tenancy in LA City, they are now required within 3 business days to send a copy to LAHD. So LAHD can compile this data and put it together. And this is for at-fault notices, for example, a 3-day pay or quit. And this would be for no-fault terminations of tenancy. So the owner wants to move in and they have to give a 60-day notice. Those must go to LAHD within 3 business days. You can break it down by council district, the category. We're going to talk about at fault versus no fault later. There's some relevancy here. It can be broken down by the notice length, how long it is, and then by zip code as well. And we can see that there's certain hotspots. For example, here at 325 West Adams, there have been 993, almost 1,000 notices have been given out at that particular address. So that's a handy tool to see where all these notices are going out. Now, it would be a mistake to assume that every single one of these notices is going to turn into an eviction where somebody is forced from their home. That's also what we're going to talk about in this video. This data that we are seeing on the heat map, and we will see in the table that's referenced up here that we're going to dive into, runs from the beginning of the year all the way through August of 2023. Clicking on the analysis link at the top of the heat map brings this up, and this is some handy compilation that Kenneth and his team have done to show you graphically how the eviction notices play out. Now, what's important to note here, this runs through the end of July. So this is July 31st, 2023. The other data sets, the heat map, and the data we're going to look at in a minute, that runs through the end of August. Why that's relevant, August 1st, 2023, a lot of tenants were required to pay back the back rent that they owed during COVID-19, and if not, they could be evicted. Now, there's specific rules. It doesn't mean all of the rent, because there are certain periods where if a tenant followed certain rules, they cannot be evicted for not having paid that back. But it's relevant to see if we see a big, huge spike. As you can see, the number of eviction notices filed peaked in April of 2023 and have since gone down. February of 2023, the numbers are lower there because the majority of these, as it says here, 96 were for non-payment of rent. In February, technically, LA City, if you weren't paying rent due to COVID-19, you were protected under LA County protections, and I released a bunch of videos at the time. So I think that's important to take a look at it graphically, and you can see it broken down visually. A lot of work put in by Kenneth and his team here. If you click the link at the top that says table, you're actually able to look at the data, and this is where the rubber meets the road. This is what you need to dive into to really get the flavor of what is going on from an eviction standpoint. Now, there's about 50,000 records that show up in here. I said not all of these are going to turn into evictions where people are forced out of their house. Why do I say those things? It's actually in here where we can further explain that. So number one, not all of these notices are going to be valid notices. And what happens if a notice isn't valid? Well, number one, the landlord could figure out that it isn't valid when they attempt to take the tenant to court, and they could potentially refile the notice. So this doesn't filter for duplicates. There could be 1, 2, or 3 notices that go out. There could be duplicates in here. We don't have that. in the data. We don't know that for sure. Maybe the tenant figures out that the notice is invalid, and I encourage all tenants to make sure they're working with a good attorney because a lot of notices are invalid. I'm going to show you a few that I know for a fact are invalid. The tenant, if they're taken to court, would use that as what's known as an affirmative defense. They can bring that up in their response to the unlawful detainer, and when they get in front of the judge could throw the eviction out because of the invalid notice. Well, how do I know some of these are invalid? Well, let's take a look. So these notices, you can filter by notice date. You have the reason for the notice going out, whether it's at fault or no fault. Remember, at fault is the tenant has done something wrong. And it also has the dollar amount and the bedroom count. That's going to be a key as well to whether a notice is valid. So looking at these notice dates here, we can see that a lot of these are for non-payment of rent. The majority was about 96% were for non-payment of rent. And that is a huge, huge number. But these tenants were protected at this point in time for non-payment of rent due to COVID under the LA County regulations. So as long as these tenants followed certain rules, which was essentially filling out the declaration and getting it to the landlord, they were protected and would use that as an affirmative defense at that point in time. And that ran all the way through the end of March. A lot of these right here, due to non-payment of rent that we're seeing, because we're still in February on notice dates, these ones were invalid notices. They weren't filed correctly because you couldn't evict for non-payment of rent at that time. So those notices could potentially lose due to that reason. Another invalid notice that I've highlighted right here, as of March 27th, 2023, a landlord could only file a notice to evict for non-payment of rent if it exceeded a certain amount of rent. And this one filed March 28th, you can see it was for a 3-bedroom, and that tenant owed $25.15 when this was filed. That does not meet the required threshold. How do we know what the threshold number is? Well, this is from the LA City Renters Protection Notice. That's required to go to tenants. And another affirmative defense, if the landlord did not post a copy of this document, and I've done other content, it's much bigger than what you're seeing now. If a landlord didn't post this in a public place, then their unlawful detainer can be potentially thrown out of court. So another affirmative defense for those notices we see. And we can see just above my head where it says 3-bedroom, $28.88. That isn't sufficient. That tenant was being evicted for $25.15 for a 3-bedroom. It needed to be over $2,888. It wasn't. So that one is going to be thrown out of court. And here's another one that'll be thrown out of court. There's the address right there as well. So the notice was filed April Fool's Day 2023. And it was only 2 bedrooms, $55.50, so that meets the threshold. They could theoretically evict. But notice the date it was received by LAHD. So it was received towards the end of June. That is way longer than the required 3 business days. So here is another invalid notice. A tenant could use this as an affirmative defense in their case as well. That's another prime example where this notice is invalid and doesn't mean the tenant's going to be kicked out automatically. And one more important point, just because you receive a 3-day notice to pay or quit, here's one right here that was given out for non-payment of rent. This one is also delivered to LAHD too late. But furthermore, the amount $17.95, which would work for the 1-bedroom, maybe they actually pay it within 3 days. So that notice, that 3-day notice goes out, and some of the folks are actually going to pay the rent so that that 3-day notice is no longer valid. So that would be a case where it doesn't go into an unlawful detainer at all. Tenant doesn't have to defend themselves. They just go ahead and pay the rent. And don't forget that in many of these 3-day pay or quit instances, they may pay and stay. One more very important thing to take a look at is at fault versus no fault. We've already shown you the majority of these terminations of tenancies are non-payment of rent. We've run through that. But here we can go ahead and filter by no fault. And no fault would be the resident manager moving into the property, withdrawing the units from the market, owner or family member moving in. There are very specific rules that are set up under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, RSO, in LA City, and now the Just Cause Ordinance, which we've released content on that. I think it's very important to understand that we are seeing, while we have 50,000 records in here, we only have 75 of the records that are for no fault reasons. So while you may be hearing in the news how a bunch of landlords are taking advantage of owner move-in or are doing extensive remodels to go ahead and move into their units, but they're using it as an excuse, this is a tiny, tiny percentage of folks that are being asked to move out because of a no-fault reason, and the landlord has to pay relocation assistance in every one of these cases, whether it falls under RSO or JCO. Now, these ones, it's more likely, it's not like you can get a 60-day notice and that you could potentially stay. You will have to move, so the majority of these, even if a tenant fights, they're going to have to move out. Although here's some that could be lost. If this person truly gave a 3-day notice for no fault reason for owner or family member to move in, they're going to lose because it needs to be a minimum of 60-day, be a 60-day notice if the tenant has been there for a year or more, be a 30-day notice if the tenant has been there for less than a year. The 120-day notice is related to the Ellis Act. So these are properties that are going through the Ellis Act. They get a slightly longer notice time. And then a 90-day notice would be for a tenant who is on Section 8 who's being asked to move out from their unit for no fault reason. And landlords and renters, we've released content on LA City and no fault evictions, particularly for substantial remodel. Make sure you check that content out as well so that you follow those rules to the T. We can help you navigate that process correctly, and we have several team members who will make sure it's done right. Which evictions aren't being counted? What's not showing up in the data? Well, number one, all those landlords who are delivering notices to terminate tenancy and they're not telling LAHD, whether they don't know that they're supposed to or they're not going to tell even though they do know they're supposed to and pay those extra fees on top of that. There could be a huge number that we can't quantify of folks that are delivering notices and not turning those notices into LAHD. They're not going to be counted. The only potential way we can get a grasp of those numbers is if their renters turn them in. The other folks not showing up in the data are those who go through a cash for keys process. So landlord gives money in exchange for the renter moving out. There are specific processes that should be followed if the property is under the RSO. Doesn't mean the landlord is necessarily doing that. These would be folks who move out of their homes and they don't show up in the eviction numbers because they've accepted a cash for keys offer. And then another category of evictions not showing up in the data would be unlawful or guerrilla style evictions, where the landlord makes life difficult for the tenant to force them to move out. So they could turn off utilities, they could threaten the tenant, make loud construction noises, let the property go, not take care of it. And there's health and safety issues. These would be uncounted evictions that will not show up on the books unless the tenant is able to turn them in. Final piece of advice, landlords, make sure you reach out to an attorney who understands LA City evictions. You can also reach out to LAHD for advice as well. And renters, if you're given a notice to terminate tenancy, make sure you reach out for legal assistance as soon as possible. One place you can turn is stayhousedla.org. They can give you assistance if you've received a notice, and also if you've received unlawful detainer paperwork, make sure you reach out to tenantpowertoolkit.org. Let us know in the comments below your stories about evictions, whether you're a landlord or a renter. And if you found this video informative, you're not going to want to miss this next one. Thanks for tuning in. This has been Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates, Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, and we can't wait to hear from you.